All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on the FAA's Powered Lift Special Federal Aviation Regulation, or SFAR. My name is Mo Hoffman, and I'm honored to be your moderator for this important and timely discussion. The FAA has introduced this SFAR to integrate powered lift aircraft into the National Airspace System. Powered lift aircraft, such as electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, can take off and land vertically, like helicopters, but also cruise, like airplanes. Though powered lift was first introduced in the Code of Federal Regulation in 1997, they've never been integrated into operation rules or even air carrier regulations. That didn't happen at that time. This SFAR establishes guidelines for pilot certification, training, operational requirements, and everything else that's needed to address the unique characteristics of these vehicles. The regulation is pivotal in enabling advanced air mobility, which facilitates the safe introduction of these innovative aircraft that are going to be designed for use as urban air taxis, cargo delivery, and emergency services, such as ambulance services or disaster-related services. In this case, the SFAR is going to be in place for 10 years while the FAA gathers data and information through regulatory requirements. Now, some of those requirements are going to be regular, formal, and informal interactions with the public and the industry. Some of those things will include conferences, data sharing, and outreach initiatives. There's also an aviation rulemaking committee that was mandated by or in accordance with the FAA's Reauthorization Act of 2024. And then there are going to be some other informal observations that are used to help make this a permanent long-term regulation. Today, we are joined by an incredible number of panelists here that are experts in their field. They bring very diverse opinions and perspectives to this topic. They've worked with key stakeholders. Those stakeholders have included industry, regulatory bodies, and a number of companies, which include OEMs as well. Each of our panelists have these unique insights, and they're going to talk about it in a moment. So before we go, let's talk about how this discussion is going to unfold. We will begin with a few questions for each one of our panelists, and they will talk about a number of things in the SFAR, which include some of the key provisions, impacts of the SFAR on stakeholders and on the public. Then we'll dive into some practical implications of the SFAR, training pilots, operational safety, and some of the regulatory guidelines that exist out there. And then finally, we'll open the floor to questions, first starting with those that have joined us virtually, and then audience questions from inside the room. Our goal today is to have a robust discussion and conversation that clarifies the opportunities that exist, but also the challenges that are posed by the regulation, and hopefully identify some actionable steps moving forward. Before we begin, let me remind everyone of the ground rules, which is keep your dialogue respectful and on topic, and try and save your questions for the Q&A portion, as I mentioned, after we talk with the panelists. So with that, I'd like to ask my panelists to introduce themselves briefly. I wrote to pause and repeat briefly, because they're very accomplished and they can talk about a number of things that they've done for the industry. So introduce yourselves, include your name, the company that you currently represent and your role, and then any relevant expertise. And we'll do it in alphabetical order, so we'll start with you, Kristen.
Thank you so much. Sorry. So Kristen Costello, I lead regulatory affairs for Beta Technologies, which we are an electric aerospace manufacturer in Burlington, Vermont. Prior to that, my career was mainly in traditional aviation. So I flew as a flight instructor for 141 operations, and then went into a 142 training center, followed by Part 91 and 135 corporate operations flying Citation CJ series and XLS Plus aircraft. Then went into the UAS industry for a time prior to coming to Beta.
Thank you, Kristen.
Hey, Charlton Evans. I'm the CEO of Endstate Solutions. We're a firm that focuses on emerging tech in aerospace. Our tagline is "We certify autonomy in aerospace," and we've worked a number of projects from small UAS to large, even HAPS mobile, and everything in between, including EAM. So the company's been focused on that since about 2018. Prior to that, I worked with Paul at In-Situ in 2012 and 2013. We got a lot done in the UAS space with some historic waivers there. There's actually an aircraft in the Smithsonian with our names on it due to that work. And subsequently, we actually worked with Kristen in the drone industry as well. So won't go into any more detail, but suffice to say that we're across the industry and having a good time and would say definitely an exciting and growth segment.
Thank you, Charlton.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul McDuffie. Some familiar faces in the room, I'm happy to see. I'm kind of the old guy in the room. I'm now a domain expert with Cobic. Prior to that, I was 30 years with Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. I was their vice president of aviation training, chief pilot. Went from there to In-Situ, working with my friend Charlton at the end of the room there, working as the VP of Flight Operations and Training, developing and deploying the ScanEagle UAS primarily. After In-Situ's acquisition by the Boeing company, I joined Boeing, worked with them on their development of their cargo air vehicle UAS. Following that, was recruited to join a Hyundai subsidiary called Supernal, developing their still in development air mobility aircraft. I'm still an active pilot, 54 years in the aviation industry, and really looking forward to today's engagement. Thanks.
Anthony Milligan, 35 years air traffic experience. Started off in a tower in Santa Barbara, ended up in a TRACON in Chicago, and also worked at a couple of en route facilities in the command center. At the end of my career, I came to headquarters and spent some time working on the UAS integration office for air traffic, and spent a lot of time explaining to managers out in the field how they're supposed to accept, how they're supposed to, what some of the work that they're supposed to be doing with UAS as it's incorporated into the NAS. My time at Chicago Center, I was lucky enough to meet and work with Mo here. Working afterwards, a principal consultant here with Cobec, lucky enough to work with Paul at Supernal and helping them with some of their ConOps and route development. And Mo, I don't believe that you've introduced yourself yet, so.
I assigned that task to Anthony, and you see how well he did with that. Mo Hoffman, I have 35 years of experience in the aviation industry, the last 5 with Cobec Consulting and previously with the Federal Aviation Administration. I have an air traffic background, and I'll leave it at that. So let's jump into the SFAR, and I'm going to give this first question to you, Kristen. Why is this an important piece of the entry into service puzzle, and what does this mean for an OEM like Beta?
Sure. Well, first off, this is, you had a great, by the way, great, overview in the beginning there. And something that can't be emphasized enough is that this is a once in a generation, once in a lifetime size regulation when you really look at it. 880 pages. Is what we were given. And I kind of say that to kind of start the conversation by saying that we're here to talk about it and we're here to start the conversation, but we are still very much digesting it and working with the FAA to make sure that our interpretations are correct and that we are ready to operationalize it. And that's a critical piece of this. So it came out in October, we're now in February, and I think that there's been significant efforts underway across the industry to do so, and the level of engagement with the FAA has been phenomenal. Going to go ahead and give that shout out to the FAA at this point, because that regulation came out, I think it was June of 2023 in the NPRM, and it was put into final rule by October of 2024. And so when you look at the size of that regulation, the amount of comments that they received, and then the fact that they were able to get it out on time really shows the dedication to this industry, and just the commitment to making sure that we are ready for entry into service. As an OEM, one of our primary challenges is that we are building aircraft while the policy is being developed. And so, that comes with a lot of unique challenges, some opportunities too. And we get to be on the forefront of helping define these things, which is amazing. But, yes, it is a critical piece of the puzzle. We now have a known quantity that we can measure against. And, it's a temporary rule by design. So, 10 years in effect, but there is a lot of language baked in that says, hey, if there's things that may need improvement, that can happen. So they've left some pathways in there that we're going to get into a little bit more there. But what we did get was we got clear pathways for training and certification, as you mentioned. And then we got some revisions to the operational rules that didn't originally consider powered lift aircraft. So all in all, industry has been very excited with what we have so far and what we view as that first step.
Thank you, Kristen. Charlton, I've got 2 questions for you. Were there any new requirements for type certification of powered lift included in the SFAR? And where can you find certification criteria for powered lift aircraft?
Okay, so no new requirements per se. These eVTOL aircraft will be certified under 2117B is the rule set, right? It's the rule of particular applicability, or the Chinese menu rule. So whatever rules apply to that particular design can be picked and chosen from the rest of the rule sets, and we come up with a G1 certification basis and then a G2 compliance basis, and that's how that works. It's not necessarily new, it's for special classes of aircraft, of which eVTOL is one. Historically, it's been applied to gliders and airships and things that don't have their own category until eVTOL emerges as its own category, and there's been some certification that we can bucket various things into. 2117B is going to continue to be the rule. The FAA did publish an AC on the rule that gives guidance on how to apply the rule. So OEMs, companies can look at that AC and at least get a start on what's going to be expected as you go through the certification process under 2117B. So not new, although the products are new and novel, and the applicability of the rule to these products is new. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. So thank you for that. The advisory circular is what provides any of the detailed information that people would need to know to go back and execute during that type certification process.
Yes, and there'll be discovery along the way because each eVTOL platform is unique in its design. So those unique elements are going to have to be addressed in that certification process, and that's exactly what this rule is for.
And one other thing that's interesting with that, and what's great from the OEM perspective, is that when you look at normalizing eVTOL aircraft, an advisory circular is optional. But what it does do is it can cut down significantly on the process. Right now, the G1s are having to be posted to the Federal Register to go through comment and all of that to basically get a final rule, and that can be a 16-month process. So when you look at the AC now, what Charlton's saying, yes, there may be unique aspects that still have to be considered and worked through, but if you are able to directly comply with the criteria that's within that AC, it cuts down on that timeline significantly. So again, kind of looking at those pieces that can help normalize, and so we're really excited about the AC and what it will drive when it comes out in its final form.
And I forgive me for the acronym, advisory circular, right?
Yes.
But so it's guidance on top of the guidance, basically.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Anthony, I'm going to go over to you, and I'll ask you first, but I'm going to invite the other panelists to join in if they'd like to weigh in. Can you obtain a waiver or an exemption from the SFAR? And if so, how is that done?
So the FAA is very clear on this, that they say, yes, you can get a waiver. In fact, they encourage you to go for waivers and go for exemptions. The rule set is very strict. It's very static. And being that these are new vehicles and being that they want to fly in different areas that's been flown before, they're not going to be able to get up and proliferate in the airspace as they want to without the exemptions, without the waivers. So on the waiver side of it, it's more or less going to lead itself toward the operational side, not always, but most cases, toward the authorization of these things and getting them out there, getting them flying in the NAS today with legacy aircraft and legacy rules and legacy equipment and everything else. That part will have to go through a process, and it's fairly well laid out. It's not quite as stringent as the exemption side of it is. You still have certain categories of things. They actually have a list of things that you can see. You can find these on a website. We can point you to those. You can go through a consulting company, something like Cobec, shameless plug, but you go through Cobec, and Cobec can help walk you through that process and help you get to the point that you want to be and show you where the pitfalls might be in following those waivers and what things to avoid and what things to focus on. As far as the exemptions and how those work, I'm going to defer to the rest of the panel on that because it gets a little bit outside of my.
Yeah, well, I'll say that everybody's trying to get away from waivers and exemptions, but until such times as things are fully normalized, there are going to be opportunities for them. The waiver parts, as you mentioned, Anthony, are more driven towards 91 operations in general, or maybe 135 in some cases, but exemptions are largely rule making against exceptions to rules. So we have to get public comment on them, they have to be posted, and then they make a final rule that is an exemption to a given set of rules. And I don't know, maybe Kristen, if you want to cite examples. We've pushed exemptions through under Part 11 for airworthiness under 44807, as well as other exemptions for pilot, commercial pilot applications for unmanned systems where really the rules around commercial pilots don't apply. So it's where there's something that doesn't fit and you can create an equivalent level of safety by doing it differently and petition for an exemption based on that. Does that make sense?
Just one quick add. I mean, the SFAR itself actually invites waivers and exemptions. There are specific wording in the document where, frankly, the FAA doesn't have enough data, information, or whatever to establish a specific requirement. So they're reaching out to industry to provide information relative to their individual operational experience, which will then, in fact, go into either corrections, additions, modifications to the SFAR, or certainly consideration in a final rule down the road. But that's the beauty of the Special Federal Aviation Regulation. It welcomes the opportunity for information gathering, requests for exemption, so that we can get it to the day where there are actually routine operations of these vehicles.
Thank you, Paul. Now that you've warmed up your microphone, I'm going to come back to you with the next question. What are the unique requirements for pilot certification relative to powered lift aircraft?
It's probably not so unique. It's something that you would expect. These are aircraft, and they're going to be piloted by someone. There'll be a pilot in command on board. If they're autonomous someday, there will still be an individual responsible for the operation of that aircraft. As such, the regulations require that that pilot in command be certificated. They'll hold a commercial pilot or an airline transport pilot or a private pilot certificate should they operate these vehicles privately. Under the SFAR, with the establishment of the powered lift category, there now is a path to add powered lift category to a pilot certificate, whether it's an ATP or commercial or private. It would basically say airline transport pilot, powered lift. The FAA designates or demarcates aircraft type and qualification to fly the aircraft in 3 different ways. There's a grade of pilot certificate, and then there's category, class, and type. There now is the powered lift category, and as Charlton mentioned, a new requirement for a type rating. These aircraft are so unique, not only in their flight characteristics, but they differ from each other. And the SFAR is now requiring a specific type rating based on the actual vehicle that the pilot would be flying. There's also provisions for the addition of a powered lift instrument rating for individuals operating these things under IFR rules, and a flight instructor certificate with powered lift ratings added to it. So this is kind of new territory from that regard, but it does follow the normal progression of pilot certification that applies to helicopters, airplanes, or other traditional aircraft.
Thank you, Paul. Kristen, I'm going to come back to you. So Beta is uniquely positioned in the industry with a dual seat aircraft. I was going to ask this question a little bit later, but it came up now. So how has the final rule helped in shaping your future for that particular plan for training?
Sure. So, so we do have a dual seat configured cockpit within our aircraft. And what that has actually done, our training path actually has been relatively unchanged as a result of the SFAR, just actually providing a little bit more clarification. When we developed our aircraft, and one of our things we always say is our aircraft is made by pilots for pilots. So every flight that we've ever done has been with a pilot in the cockpit. We've transitioned our VTOL aircraft with a pilot. I think we're one of the only OEMs to have done that, a full transition with a pilot at this time. But what the SFAR has allowed us to do is basically look at what expanded options we have. So for every powered lift pilot, you're required to have 50 hours powered lift category time, so that's total time in powered lift aircraft. And so how we can structure that is just couple of different ways now. We have some flexibility. We can do all 50 hours in the aircraft if we can. Part 61, we could do a Part 142 training center with an FTD, or we could do FTD FFS combination. So flight training device, full flight simulator. Thank you for calling the acronyms. So again, and what happens there is when you start to incorporate those layers of simulation, then the time required in the aircraft does start to go down. If we chose to do all 50 hours in the aircraft for the total time, we could claim 15 hours in a flight training device, for that. So, just some varying pathways there that we can do. But because of the flexibility that our design provides, we've been able to kind of incorporate that into our training pathway. I would just to add one thing that's also a little bit unique about us is that we have a conventional takeoff and land aircraft model that is sister to our vertical takeoff and land. So the two aircraft variants that we're certifying, the conventional is a single engine electric airplane that has about 75% commonality in the systems between that and the VTOL. So we've actually used that to start structuring our training program as well, where basically that stepwise approach to certification, now we have a stepwise approach to training. So what we've started setting up with our CTOL training program over the past few years has actually also been in development for our VTOL, which is a lift plus cruise design. So basically you get that foundational knowledge of how to fly the conventional, the wing-borne operations, and then the last phases of the training would be basically going into that VTOL curriculum. So just kind of interesting there, and it's great to see the differences in how the different OEMs are approaching this. We've got a lot of different variants and different approaches to it, and so it's been really nerd out moment for me. It's been really fun to see the different ways that the OEMs are approaching this.
So I'll categorize this as a prequel question, which is, will the FAA allow training to take place in aircraft in the powered lift category with single flight controls?
Yes, and this is a really important provision of the SFAR. I think there are so many OEMs that do have that single seat provision, and so that was a huge piece of the comment was, hey, we've got to find a way to do this. The FAA did come up with 3 what they call alternate pathways. And basically the first one, alternate pathway 1, is having a single control that is instantaneously accessible by both student and instructor, so that if there was intervention needed, that could be done. The second one was the expanded use of simulators to get the applicant the knowledge and the experience that they needed prior to solo. And then the third is that deviation pathway. So kind of to what Paul was talking about earlier, this is another way that they're like, hey, bring us something that we can see, how are you guys doing this? And then it could inform on future rulemaking. And so again, it's been interesting when you kind of look at the different pathways against the OEMs out there, and you can say, well, I think they're going to do this or this. But I have heard that some people are actively looking at that third pathway just to say, okay, what can we do? And yeah, so it's pretty neat.
Thank you, Kristen. Paul? Kristen just sort of talked about it a little bit. I'm going to come back to you. These flight simulators and training devices to train pilots, are there requirements for these?
Oh, there sure are, Mo. When people use the term flight simulator, the Microsoft Flight Simulator comes to mind in a lot of people's craniums. We're not talking about that level of simulator. There are clear differences between a simulator and a flight training device, for example. The FAA specifies requirements under Part 60 of the regulations as to what level of certification a particular device has. The higher or the more sophistication, the more fidelity with the actual aircraft, the more credit the FAA will provide to the training organization for training pilots. The SFAR specifically calls out an ability to use high-end flight simulators, level C, level D, which is kind of akin to what most airline operations have with their big, 6 degree of freedom machines, to be utilized to log the supervised operating experience, for example, that's necessary with a type rating. So that's a bit unique, and so it's really important for OEMs, training organizations to obviously work hand in hand, be familiar with the requirements of Part 60, and build devices that will allow the most training and checking credit that you can get utilizing those devices.
Okay. Anthony, 2 questions for you this time. Are there equipage requirements for powered lift aircraft mandated by this particular SFAR? And if so, why? And where will powered lift aircraft be able to fly?
So yes, there are equipage requirements. The SFAR actually has a lot of rules that are applicable to helicopters that are going to be applicable to these aircraft. At the same time, these aircraft are expected to be able to fly anywhere that aircraft are flying today. There's no limits. There's nothing offhand. If you can fly just right across the street, you can fly into the airport. You'll be able to fly into the airport with these things as well. That said, these aircraft want to be flying in and around urban areas. And with flying in and around urban areas, you have to look at surveillance, you have to look at communications, and are they going to be able to achieve everything as low as they're wanting to fly, where they're wanting to fly? Are they going to be able to achieve that under today's legacy structure? In a lot of cases, we're going to have to enhance that structure, enhance what we do, and we'll learn that as we go. The other side of this is when they want to come into the NAS and they want to fly in and around with legacy air traffic, they're going to have to be safe, and they're going to have to also be efficient. So they can't come in there and, it's kind of like putting a tricycle on a highway. It just doesn't work. So you got to make sure that the aircraft are equipped and ready to function inside a current legacy system. And with that said, there will be things like speeds. There'll be things like how they land and where they land and things like that that'll have to be adopted within the current system. But where they want to go, if it's off the airport, if it's somewhere new that we haven't been landing aircraft before, if a vertiport or something like that, where it's located, how it's located, and what type of systems we have in place there. You think about weather, you think about, can we see them from a radar, from ADS-B, or whatever we decide to use to get them and get a picture of where they're flying. And then when they want to scale up and you have this huge number of them, how are they going to interact with each other, and how are they going to interact when they get above the lower altitude stratum up into the 4,000 and 5,000 feet if they want to get up that high? How are they going to integrate with the legacy air traffic that are going in and out and transitioning out of airports and other places? So how they equip their planes to not only talk to the current legacy systems, but maybe even to interact with each other will be huge as they move forward.
Thank you, Anthony. Kristen, Does the SFAR account for experience, providing flexibility with certain requirements to ensure appropriate mitigations are in place through applicant experience and structured training environments?
Yeah, and to kind of touch on it at a high level. So we talked about these alternate pathways that are created and just some of the regulatory relief that's been built in. But when you look at how they're structuring it, when you look at the eligibility requirements, aeronautical experience is considered. So having a commercial pilot's certificate that also is a airplane with either a single or multi-engine class, and then a rotorcraft category with a helicopter class. And then the corresponding instrument rating. So that's one of the kind of prerequisites, so to speak, to use the alternate path. Another one is the structured training programs. So the alternate paths, you must do this under a 135, a 141, or a 142 approved training program. Again, beta being that we're not using the alternate pathways, we have the optionality to do this. And like I said, we are still looking at those as options. And the reason being is that another one of those relief items that was built in was a reduction in PIC time. So we talked about the 50 hours of total time that's required per, I think it's like 61-129E. Got to know the references there. But the PIC time being reduced to 35 hours, again, that can be claimed if you're doing that training under one of those structured training programs. So for beta, we say, hey, we've got this flexibility, but if we want to claim that reduction in PIC time, we have to do one of the approved training programs.
Okay, thank you. Charlton, a couple of questions for you. What are the energy reserve requirements for VFR and IFR operations for these aircraft? And will the industry manufacturers be challenged in meeting this performance criteria?
Yeah, so the SFAR speaks to that, and this is a good segue into performance-based operations, a good example for. So if the aircraft, the eVTOL, can do a vertical landing in the case of an abnormal operation, off-field emergency situation, then 20 minutes is the reserve required because along the way you can land. If, on the other hand, a conventional landing is required, then it reverts back to the fixed wing requirements. So it's, in this case, energy, not fuel, but energy to destination plus an alternate, if that's required under IFR, plus 45 minutes. So that's a much higher bar in terms of battery capability and battery technology. But again, it's performance-based. So if the industry can come up with batteries that support that, otherwise, their alternative is to create a vertical landing capability or design the aircraft that way to take advantage of that lower bar in performance to be able to land along the way, if you will. So 20-minute reserve. So that's an example of performance-based application of the rules in advance, prescriptively. And now, as we enter into certification, there'll be other performance-based elements in the certification.
Okay, I'm going to let you talk a little bit more about performance-based shortly. Paul, he just mentioned, he just talked about fuel requirements. How do these new regulations impact operational rules? Fuel requirements would be an example of that, or any of the other procedures for powered lift aircraft in IFR and VFR conditions.
Yeah, Mo, that's probably the 500-pound gorilla question in the room. The FAA and the SFAR, to their credit, again, acknowledges that these are very unique vehicles. They have the capability of flying in a vertical lift mode as well as a wing-borne mode. The specific regulations that would apply, and we're talking generally Part 91, really depend on the flight configuration of the vehicle. For example, if the vehicle is operating in wing-borne flight, essentially the rules for fixed-wing aircraft will apply. When the aircraft is operating in vertical lift mode, in a landing or takeoff configuration, the helicopter rules apply. So that impacts things like minimum safe altitude, because they are clearly different between fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters. The energy reserves are different between fixed-wing and helicopters. So the complication here is, what happens at the transition point? When do the rules change, if at all, relative to the flight operation? But again, the unique characteristics of these vehicles is going to dictate some modification or a different interpretation of long-standing existing operational rules, currently under Part 91. So going to be fun to watch.
Thanks, Paul. So Charlton, I'm going to come back to you because you mentioned performance-based regulations. This is a performance-based regulation, and I suspect that others on the panel may have something to say about this as well. Can you describe what exactly a performance-based regulation is? And you've given one, but maybe give another example of a performance-based approach that's been proposed by companies that deal in advanced air mobility.
Yeah, so the framework is airmen or aircraft, airmen, and airspace, right? That's the continuum in the NAS. And in each case, you can certify those things prescriptively and say, here are the rules, and go follow the rules to certify your aircraft, certify your airmen that fly it, and certify the operation in the airspace under 135 or 121, whatever it is. In each case, if there are elements of the design, for example, for the aircraft that enable higher performance or different performance that would enable different rules. For example, we talked about the energy, or other examples might be enhanced vision systems that help pilots fly to lower minimums, or highly integrated sensors and avionics that also sense obstacles, other aircraft that help us avoid hitting things. Then if you can apply that technology, particularly as it becomes more automated and very reliable, then we can lower minimum safe altitudes. We can have lower approach minimums, et cetera, et cetera. So those are a couple areas. There are more, obviously, but I guess to keep it brief, that's kind of the idea, right?
Okay. Any of the other panelists want to talk about performance-based regulations or rules? Last chance, because I think I'm to the last question, and it's for you, Mr. Milligan. Actually, it's 3 questions in one. Listen closely. What are the air traffic management implications that are in this SFAR, and how might they impact legacy operations? And also, since the SFAR does not currently support scheduled operations like those under Part 135, will air traffic management need to evolve as the number of these aircraft increase in the NAS?
So in a Section 7, it actually covers that current air traffic initiatives or current air traffic management techniques will be used to work these aircraft. This created quite a bit of comments in the SFAR and the rulemaking in the comment section. And one of the bigger concerns was this is going to inhibit scalability. This is going to limit the ability for them to grow at the pace that they want to grow, at the pace that they think they need to grow. FAA does acknowledge that they will continue to evaluate the need for air traffic management based on what happens in this for the next 10 years. They do reference the fact that they're similar to helicopters and some things like this, but I think what it really comes down to is evaluating what the current rules for, what the current air traffic management tools that are in the system. And air traffic management tools today are really set up to either manage an en route sector or to manage an airport. And they do this for an en route sector. They'll either move planes out of that sector by rerouting them, they'll cap them underneath and tunnel them under that sector, or they'll use speed control and do some things like that. For the airports will set an arrival rate based on the number of aircraft that they can land per hour, which also might be impacted by how many aircraft that can depart if it's a similar runway operation. And a lot of different complexities go into that, but they really have just a number of tools that they will do to manage that, and that is, one is speed control. Number 2, they may run a ground delay program for that. They may also do something more drastic where they do a complete ground stop. And we see that when we have very bad adverse weather conditions. When you start talking about TRACON airspace or towered airspace, there really isn't any grand plan or grand rule that they can use to manage that. It generally comes down to that controller and what's going on in that airspace, whether it be weather, whether it be an emergency or something else that's impacting their ability to handle as many planes as the sector is wanting to have go through it at that time or scheduled to go through it at that time. So now you're adding a new entity to that according to this is going to be unscheduled, is going to be So you're leaving the management of that sector up to the person working that sector. So when they say air traffic management tools, there's really nothing in place other than that sector being worked by that controller, determining what they need. And they may reach out to the sector next to them, they may reach out to something else, but it's really setting at that level.
Thank you. All right, so right now, I'm going to give the panelists, if there's any final thought that a panelist has about something that has not been covered, I'd like for you to offer it now. At the same time, I'd like to ask the audience to think about your questions, and for those of you that have joined virtually, please put your questions in the chat, and we will start getting to those questions as quickly as we can. So anything, final words from the panelists before we go to questions?
So just in the context of the SFAR itself, this is one element. As I mentioned, aircraft, airmen, and airspace, there's connective tissue between all that has to be accounted for. The FAA's provided this as kind of a pressure relief valve for the airman piece, and it connects to all the other pieces. So it's going to drive a lot of innovation and gives the industry some predictability in where to go and how to design their aircraft and how to accomplish certification in their operations. So that's why people are excited about it, I think, and it's a degree of predictability that didn't exist before.
Yeah, and I think Kristen brought up the point that when you think about the rulemaking process, the notice for proposed rulemaking, that happened in 2023, and to turn this rule around so quickly and to take in all of the comments that were made by industry, I think that it was considered wildly successful and wildly positive. So again, kudos to the FAA for that work. It does not appear that we have any questions that have come into the chat virtually, so I'd like to go ahead and open up to the audience to ask questions. Just raise your hand and Cleo will provide you a microphone. And let's go.
Well, here's my question. My name is Peter Lewis, and my question to the panel is, in consideration of the CONOPS versions 1 and 2 for urban air mobility and provisions therein for order flights, okay, which are highly predictable, as well as the provision of PSUs or providers of services for UAM. Do you see the day that after all the maturity levels, to 5 or 6, that we would be at a point in time when caretakers could fly these aircraft as opposed to full-blown pilots?
So I want to repeat the question for those who didn't hear it. And Peter, please, I may not have captured every nuance of the question, but there have been concept of operations documents offered and authored by the FAA in conjunction with industry that talks about the future of advanced air mobility and urban air mobility. And there are provisions within that concept of operations for entities to have authority and responsibility for the airspace. There are maturity level milestones that speak to what will happen at a certain point in time in the future. And I believe, to sort of capture what you were saying, are we going to get to a point where people that don't have the types of experience in aviation that I believe Kristen spoke to in answering one of her questions, but someone like me, who I am not a pilot, be able to operate some of these vehicles? All right. Who would like to answer that question?
I'll start. And the start is that, yes, all that exists within the CONOP, which is effectively theoretical at this point. And now it's back to onto the OEMs, the manufacturers, to come up with all the technology that's required and to make the autonomy that pieces that technology together certifiable, right, to a high level of reliability. And that's all the technology I think exists, but stitching it together and being able to certify it, to put it under an air carrier certificate is still a challenge that's ahead of us.
Yeah, and I've noticed that I don't recall if during another part of anyone's discussion if the word autonomous has come up. So let's address that now. Within the SFAR, there are no requirements about autonomy. It's silent on that. It's obviously something that will become part of the evolution. The beauty of the SFAR in collecting data and information is that it will inform what is needed in order to enable some of the autonomy that is being planned with advanced technology. Paul?
So just, one thing that runs around the vast voyage of my mind here, the thing that we are concerned about, whether we're, existing operators within the NAS or anybody else for that matter, is the whole issue of public acceptance of these vehicles. This is new, and there have been studies done by some reputable organizations that have surveyed the public, and there's some negativity out there about the likelihood that somebody would feel safe, comfortable, and using one of these things as a reliable and available form of transportation. As someone who's, again, my life has been aviation and watched it kind of evolve over the last half a century. God, that's a long time. I see these vehicles, at least in their initial phases, as almost being the point of the entry-level position for pilots. Traditionally now, young pilots come up through the ranks to, move to transition to the major air carriers through the traditional flight instructor role, banner towing, light aircraft operations, and so on. These are, 4 to 6 seat aircraft that, will carry passengers potentially for compensation and hire. And as such, the training requirements have to be stringent enough, but not so onerous that we can't supply the future need for these pilots to the level that is necessary. But I am concerned about the public acceptance point, and the more autonomy is obviously going to probably raise a lot of questions in the part of the general public as they involve themselves with these aircraft.
Thank you, Paul. Any additional questions from the audience?
Hello. Follow up to that, and I'm not a pilot and I don't know anything about pilot training, but if you're saying there's an aircraft that has both helicopter type power lift, upright, vertical lift, and then fixed wing, isn't the training then actually harder because you have to learn sort of both? And I don't know if it's you're a pilot, did you have to learn both? Is that automatic, or is that a completely different type of aircraft? And you have to think about safety and maneuverability during a safety crisis. Those are two different types of maneuvers, right, to try to get out of those things. So how does that fit into being an entry-level position versus maybe more advanced?
So I was going to say, so looking at the prerequisite to hold, like an airplane rating or a helicopter rating up front, I think, yes, there's going to have to be some, for myself, I'll tell you guys, I have an ATP and I've experienced pilot in jets. I have never even been in a helicopter in my life. So I would probably be that person that's like, what is a hover? I don't, there's going to be a learning curve with it. One of the pieces that I won't get super deep into, but when you look at the ACS that's associated with this, what is it?
ACS?
You want to say the acronym?
No, I don't know what it is.
Basically what does it stand for?
Airman
Certification Standard. Yes. So when you're looking at the ACS, the Airman Certification Standards, it's interesting because one of the things that we identified when looking at this is that actually as a training provider, you will be tailoring your syllabus based on the applicant's prior experience. So there's things that basically tasks that need to be done if you are a rotorcraft pilot or an airplane pilot coming into it. So that's just something that our training folks flag to say, hey, you do have to account for that. So just an interesting tidbit I don't know if that answered the question fully, but go ahead.
So I was a Harrier guy in the Marine Corps, and we went through about a year of training to learn how to fly that airplane because there were 6 ways to land it and 5 ways to take it off, and a lot of vertical work, right? and it was very manual. So there was a lever for the nozzles and a lever for the throttle. And you had to manage all kinds of other stuff going on at the same time. So it was very intense to figure all that out. It wasn't hard once you figured it out, but it took about a year to figure it out. And I've flown all the simulators from the different OEMs. They are so highly automated that most 6-year-olds could probably figure it out pretty quick. So the automation has come so far in managing the energy of the aircraft and how it transitions. And I mean, you just tell it to stop and it'll stop, right? And you tell it to go up and it will go up. And then you tell it to go over there and it will go over there. So that's the level of certification, that automation that is certifiable, meaning that you can demonstrate that it'll do it the same way again and again and again as performance intended function, you know, to at least the degree that general aviation works, which is a pretty low bar, and then go further than that, that's doable. So that's why there's a path to this for pilots and the equipment.
So as a long-time flight instructor, I'll put my old geezer hat on. I mean, teaching someone the stick and rudder skills to fly a helicopter or an aircraft, not that bad. It's traditionally been done for 100 and some odd years. I've flown helicopters. I've flown a lot of fixed-wing jets, the whole 9 yards, and not so bad. These are totally unique vehicles, and as Charlton said, they don't even have conventional names for their quote flight controls. They're called inceptors. That's pretty unique. But pilot training is more than just the stick and rudder skills. It's judgment. It's interpreting things like weather, making the right decision relative to any day-to-day operation. So experience counts. Whether it's just trying to figure out how to fly the vehicle, get it off the ground, and put it back down. There's more to it than that. So this is still a chapter that still has to be written, and in terms of where this goes and how far it needs to go to find qualified individuals to fly these aircraft safely in the NAS under all weather conditions.
Yeah, just one thing to add there, and I think you kind of nailed it there. And I think there is going to be some, that learning that happens. But one of the things, with the OEMs like our aircraft, others that are building these right now, I think because we are in this unprecedented era of, technology and advancement, and when you look at these vehicles, they're so simple. Like when you get into the cockpit, it's just clean and it's just intuitive. And so I think that's another factor that we aren't necessarily, me as a traditional aviation pilot, where I'm like, where are my million switches and all the things, and you get in and honestly, we even, our cockpit design that we have, when we were going through it with some folks from a regulatory agency, and we put a picture up on Zoom and we're looking at it, and they just stopped, and there was like a 10-second, just like silence, and they just could not even, like looking at it, and they're like, that's it.
Where's all the things?
That's it, and so I do think, optimistically speaking, that that does factor in as well.
So I think this is something interesting too, and going back to your question, talking about the PSUs, talking about the corridors and the things as far as full maturity in the ConOps and everything, is that while they have all this technology and all this emphasis and all this power going into their development, the other side is not keeping up right now. And it's almost as if it's waiting to accept this, waiting to see, can they really do it? And once that happens, Charlton, you talked about how it all weaves together and everything else. That will be the next phase of this, is how does air traffic accept this? How do we take a PSU and, strategize that layer of altitude? Do you do by sector? How do you give airspace away? Or you can't work the same airspace, so who's going to have what? How does that, what are the rules to play by, and what are the requirements for everybody to meet? And just the challenges that lay there, you think about that, then blending in what they have is going to be a little ways out in the future.
Yeah, when you throw the AI component in, and the fact that the objective is not to fly higher than 2,500 feet. So it's not like you're an Amtrak pilot that's taking an Amtrak train from New York to San Francisco. flying that aircraft. And I think by the time we get to UML level 6, that's sort of the intent, is to replace that pilot seat with a passenger seat and let the AI and let the PSUs fly these aircraft in fixed quarters, and they'll land and take off accordingly. You know, and I think when you mix all that together, by the time we get to 2040, 2050, that's potentially where we're going to be with these eVTOLs.
2050.
So we have, I know, so we have two more questions. Hisham has the microphone
have
still,
another
Marina, so
question.
that's why we can't get it to you right now. Go ahead, Hisham.
So back to public acceptance, and this kind of, it's all related to that. So there's, you know, for me, like visually or thinking in the future, for these things to make money, they have to be, we're going to see them. Like if we pulled up the blinds, they'd be constantly going for this to actually be a business in the future for companies. So does SFAR, maybe it doesn't, but does it talk about two aspects of that? One is both visual and noise kind of pollution, if you will. I know they're less quiet than, like 100 times less quiet than helicopters, right, or something. But still, you get enough of them, it's going to be, and then you add in package delivery and all this other stuff. And then, you know, micro weather and ride quality, does it talk about any of that stuff? Because it seems like it'd be fun to fly it, but it could be a bumpy ride.
All right. Who would like to, anything in there?
Just kidding.
I know.
Parking lot, that question, come back to it later.
So in terms of acceptance, I will tell you that there's going to be a small crowd that's eager to do this, right? The early adopters. My dad's 85, and he bought a Tesla Model 3 with full autopilot. I said, why? He said, to extend the time that I can drive, right? So he's an early adopter that's motivated by the automation so that he doesn't go hit stuff. There will be folks out there that are so tired of trying to get the commute done between point A and point B that their time is more precious. They're willing to take that first step. Are we going to darken the skies overnight? I don't think so, but they'll be an early adopter phase.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing, like what Beta's doing on the community acceptance side, I mean, I think that one of the words that honestly always gets associated here is air taxis. And like you're saying, we think of it out here in the urban environment and what's going on. But, you know, I think what's really going to bridge that community acceptance is the regional air mobility aspects of it. So like we're certifying cargo first. There's the medical, the military logistics, like those things, right? I grew up in rural Kansas. My closest hospital, Walmart, you name it, was 40 miles away, and all that was between me and there was farm. So like it was just very hard to get resources. So if you can bring in a cost-effective solution that is low noise and all those things, right? I even just think in terms of, again, small town Kansas, it shouldn't be this way, but I remember when you'd hear somebody had a medical event and they got medevac flight, you know, on a helicopter somewhere. And the first thing that somebody thinks about in a small community where people don't make a lot of money is, oh my gosh, that medical bill. And so when you think about these aircraft and that, you know, I think it's like, I can't even remember what the figure was, but it's something like hundreds of dollars of jet fuel is like $20 of electricity. And then you've got lower maintenance costs because it's a simplified design. You know, things like that make it a more cost-effective solution for communities and can unlock some of that. I think that's where you really start to bridge into the community acceptance prior to us getting into the air taxi environment.
Thank you all, you brave souls. Marina.
So yes, my question, I think you actually just sort of answered it. I was going to, and I might have missed this. I was a little bit late, I apologize, but I was just going to ask about some more general uses. And you mentioned military, that was one I was going to ask. Like, for example, instead of using traditional helicopters going to and from different bases, you know, and I also thought about the medical as well. So you sort of were answering that. This is a potential use for these.
Absolutely. And, you know, what we've been doing over the last 5 years with our prototype aircraft that we have is we've actually been doing simulated military exercises, so to speak. So we actually did simulated casualty evacuation events. We went down to and did a joint tour with the Air Force, where basically they were kind of looking at how to use these and implement them effectively. So I do think that there's a lot of applications there. And then, like we talked about with the cargo and air ambulance and all of that. So I really think that the door is wide open. And I think right now, like I said, you do hear mainly about the air taxi, model, but really we've had all sorts of things come to us, and I think that if it can be certified for it, why not?
Thank you.
So we're going to wrap up. I'm going to ask Charlton, based on that question, I'm going to ask Charlton to sort of talk about what InState does in relationship to some of those things, and then I'll ask one of my peers from COBEC to do the same thing.
Yeah, we primarily work left of type certificate on the timeline. We also do work on the operational side for waivers and exemptions, but the meat of it for us is really how do we get these things certified so that you can go have an operation, and what waivers and exemptions do you need to get into service. So that's what we do, and I think it's very complementary to what COBEC does, and away we go.
There's a handoff there, gentlemen.
So COBEC has worked with people like Supernal and other groups, and we do everything from helps with the ConOps development, help with the route development, help with the, which helps them with the design of the aircraft, and we push the envelope as far as what they're thinking, what they're wanting to do, and where they're wanting to go with it. And Paul, I'll defer to you if you have anything to add.
No, I really don't. I mean, so much of the work that the OEMs are doing, correctly so, is building the vehicle and getting it certified. That's the first step. We, COBEC, and with our partner now InState, are looking kind of beyond that. Okay, now we have certified vehicles. What do you do with them? How do we get them into the NAS on a routine basis, convince the public that they're safe, provide the FAA with, good data on how they're performing, and, basically develop the long-term solution for the integration of these things into the NAS. The work we did over the last year, really dissecting the terminal airspace in some very busy areas to try to figure out how to operate these aircraft both under visual flight rules and instrument flight rules. Really challenging. You'll see around the room some of the technology that the company has developed, looking at potential route structures in and around the LA basin for operating AAM vehicles in an IFR kind of environment. So there's a heck of a lot of work to be done to get where we need to be. Fortunately, the SFAR does open the door for us. It's giving us, okay, here's where the rules are now. Now we build procedures and policy and ConOps based on what that rule says. So that's kind of the life for us going forward on this.
Thank you, Paul. I wish I had some AI to reconcile my closing remark and statement with the one that I just got here. I want to thank everyone who attended and joined virtually and in person. Special thanks to our panelists, and a huge thanks to Cleo, Jen, Nick, and Nate for helping make this all possible. We do have a recording of this, and it will be made available at the conclusion, which is in a matter of minutes. And for more information, cobec.com. And with that, cobec.com/advanced air mobility, AAM. So with that, have a fabulous evening, everyone, and let's enjoy happy hour. Thank you all. That was